Very tragically, but still ironic, the usage of this Z letter. And I want to quote Jonathan Katz at the German Marshall Fund. He writes, like the Nazis' use of the swastika as a symbol of power, Putin is using the letter Z as a symbol to rely Russians and to justify unconscionable actions in Ukraine. In the end, history will view Putin and his regime as war criminals, just like Hitler and the Nazis. So my question is, in this parallel, what future may await for Putin and what may intervene in it? Business as usual or something else? How do you think?
Well, Putin, again, we need to be clear about what he's guilty of. He's guilty of imperialism. He's guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, but he's also guilty of genocide. And that needs to be emphasized. I mean, so a whole range of criminal activities can be ascribed to Putin, but not just to Putin, because Lavrov, Narishkin, and many of these other individuals are equal. Patrushev, of course, they're also responsible. Not just responsible, but they're guilty. And of course, those Russian soldiers who've committed atrocities, who bombed Ukrainian hospitals, kindergartens, civilian targets, they too are guilty, not just of war crimes, but of genocide. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, what is his future? Again, it's perfectly possible that he will be removed from power by a coup d'etat initiated by disgruntled Russian elites. That argument has been made by many Russian analysts. It's been made by Ukrainian analysts. It's been made by Western analysts, including myself. So it's not inconceivable, and indeed perfectly possible, that given the appropriate circumstances, for instance, a major Ukrainian victory, either on the battlefield or in the war, could lead to a coup d'etat, a putsch, and a removal of Putin. And under those circumstances, he could conceivably be killed. This happens very often in coups. Or alternatively, he could be arrested and blamed for all of the atrocities and criminal activities that his regime engaged in. And not only blamed by the West, not only blamed by Ukrainians, but also by Russians, because they will be looking for a convenient scapegoat. And one can easily imagine generals, Chekists, and many others saying, we were okay, we were clean, this wasn't our fault, this wasn't our war. Blame it all on this evil man called Putin, blame it all on Lavrov, and so on. And in that case, his fate is likely to end up in The Hague with the willing participation of Russian elites. Alternatively, if Russia loses the war, or I should say, when Russia loses the war, because it will lose the war, regardless of who ends up in power in the Kremlin, Putin is likely to end up at The Hague as well, unless, of course, he commits suicide or finds some refuge in North Korea, China, or Iran. Those might be the only countries willing to take him in. So my sense personally is that sooner or later, almost regardless of the scenario, regardless of what happens, Putin will end up on some criminal bench facing the court, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The only exception to this would be if Russia wins or manages to hold off the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And under those sorts of circumstances, and I think that's extremely unlikely, then Putin, of course, will be able to present himself as an all-powerful leader.
And actually extremely unlike, as you said right now, that he will commit suicide, because from what we see, how he's afraid to die in any cases from COVID or from assassination or whatever. He's preserved very much, so it shows that he don't want to die. But anyways, from the point of view of trial, as you said, how far his guilt may go through the history, because I want to remind a little bit that the war against Ukraine began in 2014, and even then it would be possible for the world to somehow stop this Russian imperialism. But Ukraine is not the only country affected by Russia. In August 2008, the Russian-Georgian War began, which Michael Emerson called the first war of the 21st century in Europe. Was it possible to stop Putin and the Kremlin then? How do you think? And or who is to blame for the second stage of war in Georgia? Because I want to remind you that the first one was Abkhazia. And it wasn't Putin, it was Yeltsin. But still, the international society just closed eyes and didn't look up to the history of the Second World War and of the Reagan regime of Hitler. It wasn't the time, like now we are discussing the peculiarities of these two regimes. But who is to blame for that period? And was it the time when we could stop this and there wasn't war in Ukraine right now?
I mean, yes. I mean, the answer, the simple answer is yes, it could have been prevented. Unfortunately, of course, it wasn't. And it wasn't because neither Europe nor the United States took Putin and his regime seriously, or seriously enough. It was always the case that the regime was considered to be, well, authoritarian. But the explanation for the authoritarian regime was, well, this is what the Russians want. So Putin is simply doing what the Russians want. This is part of Russian culture, and that's arguably the case. But the ultimate effect of this kind of thinking was to make Putin somewhat benign. He wasn't quite the evil monster that he's turned out to be. So there was that problem. Sort of a underestimation of Putin, of his goals, of his regime, and the continuation of the belief that somehow one can talk to him, that that he's basically a normal leader, perhaps authoritarian, but normal. But more important, perhaps, or at least equally important, was the fact that the West never really had a coherent policy toward the non-Russian nations of the former Soviet Union. With the Baltics were the exception, right? But it didn't have a policy toward Ukraine. It didn't have a policy toward Belarus. It didn't have a policy toward Central Asia. It never fully considered them to be truly important and worthy of a policy. Again, I know this from personal experience from the very beginning, since the Soviet Union collapsed. My colleagues, my friends, and I have been incessantly arguing at conferences and papers and articles and columns that the West needs to take Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia, Georgia seriously, that it needs to have a coherent policy, that you can't just focus on Russia. And it never made any difference. It was like talking to a wall. Yes, these countries were interesting, but they weren't really important. And as you know, there are still some people who argue that Ukraine isn't really important. The only really important country is Russia. But partly because of that, or at least to a large degree because of the absence of such a policy, Putin could do things and people would say, well, it's just Putin. Well, it's just the Russians. And besides, it doesn't really matter. Georgia doesn't matter. Moldova doesn't matter. The Chechens don't matter. The Ukrainians, well, they're Russians anyway. They don't matter. And then suddenly realize in 2022 that they do matter. But unfortunately, until then, there hadn't been a policy in place. And we see this very clearly, for instance, in the decision to enlarge NATO. When the Poles, the Hungarians, and even the Romanians and Bulgarians and the Baltic states were admitted, I personally thought that was a mistake for two reasons. I believe that in admitting those countries, but failing to admit Belarus and Ukraine, the West would be creating a kind of a gray zone between the West and Russia, a kind of impossible no man's land within which Ukraine, Belarus, and the other non-Russians would continue to exist. And in expanding, but not going any further, essentially the West would be telling Russia, we're not interested in Ukraine and Belarus. You do with them whatever you like. And of course, the response on the part of Ukrainian leaders was to have this kind of multi-vector policy. They were trying to balance both sides because that was all they could do. And eventually, Ukraine decided to opt for the West. Belarus decided to opt for closer relations with Russia. But in both cases, they became much more vulnerable to Russian influence because of the decision to enlarge NATO, but not to encompass Ukraine and Belarus. Had NATO enlarged in the early 2000s when Poland and Hungary were admitted, or had it enlarged in 2008, there would have been no war. Russia was in no position to invade. Its armed forces were in terrible condition, even worse than today. NATO was much stronger and much unified. And yes, the Russians would have been upset. And yes, the Russians would have been shouting and screaming bloody murder. But they couldn't have done anything about Ukraine's membership. So the West could have prevented the war by taking Ukraine seriously, by either incorporating Ukraine in NATO or not enlarging NATO. Either of those solutions would have been adequate for Ukraine, but the West failed to do that because it did not take Ukraine seriously. And it's only now that it's actually taking Ukraine seriously, and that'll make a big difference. But unfortunately, the price that Ukraine has to pay is war.